Wix Studio, one end-to-end web creation platform for your agency to deliver exceptional work with absolute efficiency.
Taylor Swift is a link builder. There were rumors that she would get engaged. Our client said, let's give them a free wedding venue. And then we got them 50 links. That's digital PR.
Managing multiple clients or large websites? Automate your SEO with Ali AI. Start your free trial now.
Tricks on how to uncover and mitigate bias in data visualization. So let's start by beginning where bias exists. Bias exists in three core areas of data visualization, and you can think of this as building a pyramid. At the base of the pyramid, you have the biases in the underlying data that forms your visual. Next, you have cognitive biases in terms of how the brain reacts to and interprets a visual. And then finally, at the top of the pyramid, you have the biases in the visual themselves in terms of how you choose to display and present them. So it's important to understand that bias exists in many different areas. Therefore, we cannot eliminate bias. But what we can do is have processes in place to uncover bias and solutions in place to mitigate against bias, which is what today's talk is all about. So let's start at the base of the pyramid, the biases that exist in the underlying data that form our visuals. The challenge we have here are that data sets we often use are incomplete, causing what's known as survivorship bias, whereby we rely on a subset or sample of data. Here, either accuracy or precision is compromised. Understanding the role of accuracy and precision is critical in mitigating survivorship bias. And you can think of this as playing a game of archery. If you imagine the center target as your most accurate data set, the closer your attempts are to the middle, the more accurate your data. You can think in terms of precision as how close the attempts are relative to each other. This creates a quadrant, as you can see here, and where survivorship bias is prevalent, data is either in the top left or bottom right quadrant, whereby either accuracy or precision is compromised. But how do we understand this for a data set? This is where critical thinking comes in. Critical thinking is an effective technique to identify the extent of survivorship bias. And here's an example of critical thinking applied to Google Analytics data. This isn't an exhaustive list, but here's a list of key biases that impact Google Analytics data. For each of these, we understand the role of accuracy and precision. Very quickly, we can build up a picture. Here, the Google Analytics dataset is one of low accuracy and high precision. Sitting in the bottom right quadrant, it means we can use the trends with confidence, but the absolute figures need to be taken with a pinch of salt. All of this helps us to understand and mitigate against survivorship bias. Moving to our next layer of the pyramid, the biases that exist cognitively when our brains react to and interpret a visual. Science proves that the human brain processes up to 35,000 decisions every day. That's the equivalent of a decision being made every 2.5 seconds. Our brains need to reach decisions at speed, and this is where cognitive bias comes in. Cognitive bias is the human brain taking shortcuts to reach decisions at speed. There are hundreds of different cognitive biases out there, but today I'm going to focus on three that are most prevalent in data visualizations. They are the framing effect, causal illusion, and the anchoring effect. So let's start with the framing effect. Here's an example of a visual where the framing is positive. We can see that conversion rate has doubled from 1 year to the next, at which stage we may all give ourselves a pat on the back and say, job done. However, what if we framed this visualization slightly differently? Rather than looking at conversion rate, what if we looked at the percentage of audience who do not convert? Granted, there's been an improvement from 1 year to the next, but the fact remains that 90% of our audience do not convert. Seeing both sides of the coin really helps us to elevate our visualization. Not only that, elevate the insights that come from it as well. So we now know that whilst conversion rate has doubled year on year, 90% of our audience do not convert, and that continual improvement provides us with an exciting growth opportunity. So clearly a job to be done. Our next bias is the one of causal illusion. Causal illusion is where correlation is incorrectly implied as causation. Here's an example of two data sets, ice cream sales and shark attacks, plotted across time. We can see that there appears to be a correlation between the two data sets. We run the Pearson's correlation coefficient. That returns a value of 0.64, which indicates a moderate correlation. Then this bias kicks in. Correlation is incorrectly implied as causation, which gives us a couple of very bizarre insights. Where correlation is incorrectly implied as causation, it would indicate that increased ice cream consumption causes more shark attacks. Or, if correlation is incorrectly implied as causation, it could indicate that increased shark attacks is causing people to eat more ice cream. Now, of course, neither of these insights are true. There's either two things happening here. Either the correlation is completely spurious and those two data sets should never be on the same visual, or there's an underlying factor at play. Which is the case here. Air temperature is the causation. When we plot average air temperature alongside our shark attacks data, we see a very strong correlation. We run the Pearson score, it returns 0.85 to back that up. And this makes sense. As the average air temperature increases, we're more likely to go and swim in the sea, putting us at increased risk of being attacked by a shark. On the right-hand side, we're plotting average air temperature against ice cream sales. Here, we see a more moderate correlation with a Pearson score of 0.61. But again, this makes sense. As the average air temperature increases, we're more likely to be out and about on the beach and consuming ice cream. But it doesn't stop us from enjoying our favourite ice cream in those cold winter months. So, understanding all of this is critical to mitigate against causal illusion. Next, we move on to the bias of the anchoring effect. The anchoring effect takes hold when we rely on a single piece of information for our visualizations and insight. A little bit like this example where we've got CPC sessions this year versus last year. A simple visualization, but a restricted data set. Our first reaction here would be to panic that CPC sessions are in sharp decline to the tune of 24% year on year. To mitigate against this bias, we need to take a step back and see the broader picture and bring more data sets in to build up that story. So, whilst we know CPC sessions are down 24% year on year, we know over the same period that spend was down 8%. So we know reduced spend is a factor. Despite there being less spend and less traffic, we can see the traffic is of good quality, indicated by an improvement in engagement rate and a slight improvement in revenue. Furthermore, we see an improvement in ROAS, which means our marketing activity is more efficient. So by adding these extra data points, we become more informed and helps us to mitigate against the anchoring effect. So let's move to the top of the pyramid, the biases that exist in terms of how we choose to display and present our visuals. We can mitigate this visual bias with a high level of control. And there's 5 different biases that I want to talk about here today. They are scale manipulation, correlation illusion, visual distortion, color choice, and accessibility. So let's start with scale manipulation. Scale manipulation can take hold on both the Y and X axes of your visuals. Here's an example of it at play on the Y-axis. Here we're plotting views per user from Google Analytics over time. I did this in Excel, and Excel, rather unhandily, gave me a scale starting at 1.55 and ending at 1.8. A very narrow scale which is providing us with quite a jagged line chart. However, you could argue that Y-axis is not fair and representative. Views per user could be lower than 1.55 at any point in time. They could be higher than 1.8. At this stage, you're probably thinking, what's the impact of that? The answer's pretty significant. Exactly the same underlying data, but given the thought in terms of the scale you choose is critical. Here, views per user is a metric that can never be lower than 1. So that's why we've chosen 1 as our minimum limit. To keep things simple, we've gone from 1 to 2 in increments of 0.1. So you can see here that a fair scale provides an unbiased view of our visualization. Furthermore, scale manipulation can take hold on the X-axis as well. This tends to happen when you have a data set with a non-uniform time period. Take the example of UK interest rates. UK interest rates do not update on a uniform period of time. Sometimes they can update as regularly as every 6 weeks. Sometimes you can go many years before you see an interest rate change. This creates non-uniformity across the X-axis, as you can see here. I've drawn particular attention to the post-credit crunch period in the early 2010s, when there was a 6 to 7 year period where the interest rate didn't change. However, because of the non-uniform nature of this data set, it introduces bias. So to mitigate against this bias, there's a couple of things we can do. Firstly, we may want to put every 6-week period across the X-axis, giving us uniformity, but an infinitely long X-axis are probably not the best thing. Or what we could do is group the data by year, have that uniformity across year, and maybe take the average or the maximum interest rate over that given year. but uniformity is absolutely critical on your x-axis to avoid scale manipulation. Next, we move on to the bias of correlation illusion. So the illusion of a correlation that isn't there. Take this data set, for example. It's clear visually that there's no correlation. We run the Pearson's correlation coefficient. It returns a value of 0.08, which confirms this. However, all it takes is for somebody in Excel or Google Sheets is to add a so-called linear line of best fit, and that immediately introduces bias because it implies a correlation that simply isn't there. Worse still, if your data set has weak or no correlation, that best fit line could go pretty much anywhere, creating several sources of mistruth, several sources of bias. So to mitigate against this bias is simple. If your data set has weak or no correlation, do not include a line of best fit. Next, we move on to the bias of visual distortion. The rule here is not to use pie charts or donut charts, and this is for two reasons. Firstly, these charts do not have a scale, which makes it very difficult to understand size. Furthermore, the circular nature of these visuals makes it very difficult to understand relativity. If I was to ask you which one of those pie segments do you think is the biggest, you're probably finding that very difficult due to those exact same issues. If you think that's bad with a pie chart, I'd argue that this is even more difficult when we look at a donut chart. Taking out that middle focus point introduces an additional element of bias. Now you may think a different pie segment looks bigger because that middle piece is removed, introducing that bias. What's worse than a pie or donut chart in 2 dimensions is one in 3 dimensions. 3-dimensional visuals, regardless of the visual type, should be avoided. This is our pie chart from 2 slides ago in 3 dimensions. It's added additional visual distortion. We can see now the 3 pie segments at the front arguably look bigger because they've got depth. The 2 at the back don't. So avoid pie donut charts, avoid 3Ds as well. So at that point, you're probably thinking which one of those pie segments is the biggest. The simplest way to do that is to put it into a 2-dimensional bar chart. By doing so with a nice clear scale, we very quickly understand which one of those pie segments is the biggest. Kudos if you got that right. And also understand the relativity between each of them as well, helping to mitigate all of those biases that I've just talked about. Color choice can also bias how data is visualized. We rely, for example, heavily on color by association. So we associate green with positive and red with negative. When used correctly, that can be very powerful in creating a cognitive shortcut to aid visualizations and insight. However, when used incorrectly, it adds confusion and adds bias, as we have in this example. Cost per acquisition is a metric such that the lower the number, the better. However, in this case, it's been colored red, which immediately leads us to think of a negative connotation when that's not the case. So to mitigate against this bias, we would swap the colors round, use the cognitive shortcuts we've got to our advantage to aid interpretation and insights of our visual. Similar can be said for heat mapping as well. So when we're heat mapping, we associate light colors with low values, dark colors with high values. When that logic is not followed, like in this example here, it serves to add confusion and add bias. I'd argue in this visual, if you just got rid of the heat mapping altogether, the table would actually be easier to understand. Accessibility is critical in mitigating visual bias. It's something I've been given a lot more attention to in part of my storytelling and visualization. And one of the things that I now do, and you may have noticed throughout the deck today, is that I've added symbol markers to line charts. The reason for this is that if anyone in the audience is finding it difficult to process the color of the lines, the symbol markers are there as a backup, so as many people as possible can understand the visual and help to aid accessibility. Similarly, on the bar charts, you may have noticed there were background patterns on those in the pie charts for the same reason. If anyone in the audience finds it difficult to process the color, the patterns act as a fallback, so as many people as possible can understand the visual. Alt text is also key to aid accessibility. All of the visuals in this deck have alt text behind them. Not only is it great for accessibility, but I think it's also great for you as a storyteller as well. I'd argue that if you cannot explain a visual in a couple of succinct sentences, that visual probably shouldn't be in your story at all. Tables and shapes are also a great way to aid accessibility, tapping into some of those cognitive shortcuts that I mentioned earlier. And here's an example. Using arrows is a great way of understanding quickly whether something's increasing, decreasing, or stable. If we combine that with color as well, it creates that further cognitive shortcut, enabling us to understand the data quickly and aid accessibility as a result as well. So wrapping all of this up, what are my 5 key takeaways to uncover and mitigate bias in data visualization? Firstly is to know where bias exists. Bias exists in 3 core areas of data visualization, and you can think of this as building a pyramid. At the base of the pyramid, you have the bias in the underlying data that forms your visual. You then have the cognitive biases in terms of how your brain reacts to and processes a visual. And then you have the bias in the visual itself in terms of how you choose to display and present it. We looked at each of these layers of the pyramid in detail, and we started off with the role of survivorship bias. The data sets we use are often incomplete, which introduces survivorship bias. Here, either accuracy or precision is compromised. Understanding the role of accuracy and precision and where your data set sits on this quadrant is critical. Use critical thinking here to break it down, understand the role of your data set to really help understand and mitigate against this particular bias. We then looked at cognitive biases. To mitigate against the framing effect, it's about always seeing both sides of the coin. That really helps us to elevate our visuals and elevate the insights that sit behind them as well. To mitigate against causal illusion, remember that correlation does not imply causation. Question whether your correlation is spurious or whether there's an underlying factor at play, like the example we shared. It's a great way to mitigate bias. And then in terms of the anchoring effect, to mitigate against that, it's avoid analysis on a single data point. Take a step back, look at the broader picture to get that context, elevate the visual, elevate the insights as well. And then we looked at visual biases. The role of scale manipulation on the y-axis, having a fair and representative y-axis is so critical. And on the x-axis, making sure you have a uniform time period to mitigate against that bias. To mitigate against correlation illusion is simple. If your data set has weak or no correlation, and you can use the Pearson correlation coefficient to validate, do not add a line of best fit because all it does is introduce bias. In terms of visual distortion, do not use pie or donut charts because it's very difficult to understand size, scale, and relativity, and certainly avoid 3-dimensional visuals because that adds a layer of distortion. To understand that clearly, use something like a 2-dimensional pie chart with a clear scale. You can quickly understand size, scale, and relativity, making it easier to visualize and mitigate the bias. And then we talked about the role of color choice. Color by association, when used correctly, is a powerful tool to aid cognitive shortcuts. When not used correctly, all it serves to do is introduce confusion and create bias as well. And we looked at a similar example with heat mapping too. And then we rounded out with accessibility. So putting symbol markers on line charts is a great way as a fallback. So if anyone in your audience cannot process the color, the symbol markers act as a fallback. Similarly with bar charts, if you put that background pattern on, it acts as a fallback if your user cannot process the color of your visual. The role of alt text is critical, not only for accessibility, but it's great for data storytelling as well. If you can't describe your visual in a couple of simple sentences, you probably should question whether that visual should be in your data story at all. And then combining lots of those elements together, the use of tables combined with shapes to help increase or decrease, and color can create all of those cognitive shortcuts to really aid accessibility and elevate your visual. So we've covered a lot of ground in a short period of time, but hopefully I've left you with loads of tips, tricks, and actionable takeaways, and a toolkit that you can take away post MeasureFest so that each and every one of you can uncover and mitigate bias in your data visualizations. Thank you very much for listening.
Monthly reporting making you want to shove sharp things up your nose? Try Dragon Metrics, the all-in-one SEO software with mind-blowing reporting tools.